Death can occur in many ways. Like people die out of cancer, AIDS, people die out of heart attack or a road accident. Similarly, in cell biology, the death of the cell can occur in several ways, and there are several ways of cell death. In this particular video, we would focus on one of the cell death types, which is called type 3 cell death or necrosis. So in this whole video, we would look at the features of necrosis, how it is a little bit different from apoptosis and its types. So let's begin. Let's say this is an epithelial tissue, and in this particular tissue, the region which is marked in red and having a redness, in this particular region there is an attack due to a mechanical injury, or maybe there is a injury via any pathogen or any other disease. What happens is this cell dies and spills out its all cytoplasm, its membrane integrity gets lost, and it spills over all of its internal content and influencing its nearby cells. This type of cell death is classically known as necrosis, which is pretty much uncontrolled. The cell which is dying, it has no control that how much its inside material would affect the other cells, and also the pathway by which the cells are dying, it's not pretty much controlled. This particular type of death is known as necrosis. Now let's talk about the hallmarks of necrosis. The hallmarks of necrosis includes, first, it is always related to a pathological situation. Earlier we talked about apoptosis, but apoptosis could occur under normal circumstances, like for development. During development, the body or the system might want to get rid of certain cell types, and that's why it would undergo a programmed cell death. But necrosis, as far as it's concerned, it is always associated with any kind of pathological situation, any kind of damage, any kind of irreversible injury to the cell. Now, always it creates an inflammation or an inflammatory response in the surrounding tissue. It really affects the surrounding tissue, and it's a collective cell death. It's not that one cell is dying, because apoptotic mechanisms are pretty much precise, but these kind of necrotic cell mechanisms, necrotic cell death mechanisms are pretty much uncontrolled. Then the cell death type is not programmed. There are not sequential ways by which the cell dies. I mean, it's still debated, but what people really think is the cell death program is not defined. Now let's see a healthy cell. We can see this is a particular healthy epithelial cell. It has lysosomes, mitochondria, Golgi, everything intact. Let's look at what happens when the cell is undergoing necrosis. What changes takes place inside the cell at a morphological level, at a molecular and a cellular level. First and foremost, what happens is the mitochondria of the cells localize in a weird fashion, in a perinuclear way, and it forms a perinuclear ring like this shown in the figure. Now, other thing is the mitochondria suffers from swelling. The mitochondria swells, and its morphology is way different from a normal one. And surprisingly, not only its morphology, its functionality is also altered, which we would talk about. And this is one of the major cause associated with the necrotic pathway. Now, one of the biggest changes that takes place in the mitochondria is the cristae, the inner membrane invaginations. More the number of cristae, the more functional mitochondria it would be, because there could be more electron transport chain and everything. But here, in case of necrosis, the mitochondria really swells up and its inner membrane surface area is reduced. Other than that, lysosome disruption or lysosome rupture is a big problem in necrosis. When lysosome is ruptured and its content is released in the cytoplasm, then occurs a big problem, because lysosome is a bag full of hydrolytic enzymes. Now these hydrolytic enzymes are pretty much potent and always remained in a membrane bound situation. It's never released, but once it is released, it would affect cells inner workings or inner pathways or inner structures, right? That's why lysosomal rupture is a hallmark feature of necrosis. Second is like, and one of the most important feature is the plasma membrane rupture or plasma membrane integrity loss. You can see here the plasma membrane is losing its integrity, leaking, and as a result, the cytoplasmic material is leaking out and reaching the surrounding. This is a hallmark feature which never occurs in the apoptosis. In case of apoptosis, things are very different. Let's say it's a normal cell. In case of apoptosis, the cells would shrink in size and it would bleb out. But each of these small plebs are actually membrane bound component, which has their own organelles and stuff like that. But the membrane integrity is never lost, which is a hallmark feature in case of necrosis. The membrane integrity is gone and it becomes more leaky. So we pretty much looked at what are the morphological changes. Let's look at the molecular changes. The first and the foremost thing to be discussed is the calcium overload. Normally, cell has very stringent mechanism by which it can buffer the calcium levels, and maintaining a proper level of calcium is super important for the cell's functioning and the signaling as well. Because calcium is an important second messenger, right? But the calcium overload leads to many excitotoxic effect into the cell, and we would learn it about later. Especially this is super harmful for the neurons, because for a neuron, monitoring its excitability is a most important job for the neuron. And if there is a disbalance in the calcium concentration, it has been reported the neuron undergoes excitotoxic cell death or excitotoxic necrosis. Then reactive oxygen production is another big problem in the necrotic pathway, because the mitochondrial function is gone, or mitochondria are dysmorphic, they are swelling up, and it's expected the mitochondria won't function in a proper way and it would generate more ROS, which is harmful for the cell. Itself, ROS can do lipid peroxidation and thereby changing the membrane integrity. Other than that, ATP concentration is going down as the mitochondria is not that much functional and the cell has less energy to meet up its metabolic processes. Together, everything is messed up in case of necrosis. All the inner physiological processes are messed up. More than that, when the ATP levels are super low, on top of that, there is a decoupling between the electron transport chain and ATP production, which is even worse and making the ATP level even lower. So cell is undergoing a huge metabolic crisis. Not only that, in that situation when TCA cycle is absent, cell try to cope up and the pyruvate is converted to lactate. Now lactate is super acidic. It reduces the pH of the cytosol, and that low pH is harmful for the enzymes that are present in the cytosol. They get deactivated, which are important for the cell's normal physiology. In this way, as a combined effect of all these cellular and molecular features, the cell progressively moves towards its death, which is the necrosis. Now, we can talk about other features of necrosis. One of the most pronounced feature is the protease activation. These proteases are other than caspases. These are calpain and cathepsin, which are also potent protease and can cause damage to the cell. Other than that, there is another molecule called cyclophilin D, which is getting activated in case of necrosis. In this situation, mitochondrial permeability transient pore complex is opening, and many of the mitochondrial enzymes are leaking out, cytochrome C is leaking out, and mitochondrial functionality is heavily altered under this process. Moreover, there is a dissipation of the proton gradient. That's why ATP production cannot be triggered anymore, which is due to the uncoupling. And also, there is an alternation in the membrane potential of the mitochondria. Combining all of these facts, we can understand how the cell dies. Now, when the cell dies, it releases its content in the surrounding. And these damaged particles, which are produced by the bursting of this cell, and these are known as damage associated molecular patterns. This really creates an inflammatory response, and really attracts many of the innate immune cells such as macrophages and the dendritic cell to the damaged site or to the site of the cell death. Now, this macrophage and dendritic cell are phagocytotic, so they would try to take out the debris, but also they have toll-like receptors which recognize these damage associated molecular patterns. In response to that, macrophage and dendritic cells secrete several pro-inflammatory cytokine. This pro-inflammatory cytokine work like an alarming signal, bringing in more innate immune cells, more macrophages and dendritic cell to the site of location to the site, and also it can lead to neutrophil extravasation to the tissue site where there is a necrosis happening. All these things really elevates the inflammatory response. Now, let's just summarize the key features of necrosis that we have learned so far. So first, we have seen the membrane disruption is very unique for necrosis, which does not take place in apoptosis. Lysosomal dysfunction, protease activation like calpains and cathepsins, mitochondrial dysfunction, and ROS generation was a hallmark feature of necrosis. Then necrosis is always associated to an inflammatory response and other immune component activation. So that pretty much summarizes why necrosis, what are the molecular and cellular features of necrosis. Now let's talk about a little bit about the types of necrosis. Since I've already talked about that the necrosis is always associated with some kind of pathology, so these types are actually based on the pathology they are associated with. One type of necrosis is coagulative necrosis. As the name suggests, some kind of coagulation is associated with it, or clotting is associated with it. And when clotting comes in your mind, you can generally think of ischemia. In case of ischemia, this kind of necrotic mechanism take place. Other than that, there is liquefactive necrosis. It always takes place when there is an abscess. There is also fungal infection mediated sciasis, and there is fibrinoid type of necrosis where there is a blood clot related pathology which leads to death in that small blood vessel cells or like that. So that pathology is known as fibrinoid necrosis. And last but not the least, there is gangrenous necrosis. It normally happens in the lower limbs, and you can see how bad it is and how the lower limb, and in some cases the lower limb has to be amputated. So in this video, we pretty much summarized the cellular and molecular changes during necrosis. We also looked at the types and taken some example to understand the process of necrosis or this kind of type 3 cell death mechanism in a detail. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, give it a quick thumbs up. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.